What makes someone remarkable? Do you mind being described as the white people whisperer? What is the optimal age to get married?
That year was the first year that we ever heard a teacher talk about race.
Is the college application process fair?
You start to find the non-obvious way kind of works.
Is there like a cartoonist community? So many times when we go live with these things, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Boom.
Welcome to the Non-Obvious Book Review. I am your host, Rohit Bhargava, and I am very excited to have 5 of the 6 authors of an amazing book called You Should Smile More, How to Dismantle Gender Bias in the Workplace, with me today to talk about how to dismantle gender bias and give some really practical, amazing tips. They are all 6 of the authors, amazing personalities in their own rights. They have distinguished bios that would take me probably the entire show to read, but I'm going to jump into the conversation here and maybe have them just share their name first and also answer our preliminary question, which is what makes You Should Smile More non-obvious? And Katie, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Katie Lacey. And, I think one of the things that makes our book non-obvious is that we're flipping it on its head and we're saying that the little things are actually the big thing. And that these little things are the moments that happen. They happen day in and day out. And when they happen to you, they can feel too small to mention. They can feel petty. They can feel insignificant. And we're talking about moments like hearing somebody refer to a woman as a girl in the workplace, or always being asked to set up the next Zoom call, or being talked over in a meeting. And it's these little moments that add up, and that we call them bricks that build a wall. And that wall becomes, it becomes something that makes you not feel totally part of the culture. And it's what causes women to start to opt out.
I'll go next. My name is Cie Nicholson. And for me, what makes us non-obvious is these things are still happening like 30 years later, and basically our entire careers. And we know they're still happening because we went out and did hundreds of interviews, primary research with younger women to see if they're happening. And some of the reasons they're still happening is women don't want to bring them up because they seem small and insignificant. Are you really going to stop the meeting because someone says, have you met the new girl in accounting? So you kind of roll your eyes and then you just kind of move on, or whatever the point is. You don't want to feel like you're making a big deal out of it. And so because of that, they just continue. And for women, they find it very irritating and just like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? And with guys, a lot of times they don't even realize it's a thing because no one brings it up. So what we're trying to do is bring language and sensitivity to these things so we can actually address it. There's some very easy fixes for all these micro moments and move on versus just kicking the can down the road.
My name is Mitzi Short, and I think one of the other non-obvious things is that this book is also for men. And so we're not just talking about women in the workplace, but we're talking about the men who are witnesses or managers or bosses, and the role that they can play in helping us dismantle gender bias by helping identify these situations and addressing them. And we talk about solutions for each of those scenarios in the book. So men as managers, men as bystanders. One story in particular that's important to me is one of my clients talked about the book with her husband, and she was anticipating her book to arrive from Amazon. And when it showed up, her husband grabbed it and said he would read it first and tell her all about it. So again, it's not just for women, it's for men. And we're not trying to blame men. We're actually trying to call men in to support and engage as allies.
Yeah, and I have to support that. I mean, as a reader of the book, I didn't feel accused. I felt like it was welcoming. And I've read a lot of books that are about gender bias and about diversity. And some of them, it's pretty clear that the book wasn't written for me. And so I didn't feel that as a male reader, for sure.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
And just building on the point, I'm Lori Tauber Marcus. And so while we're talking about men, I think something that's not obvious is just how sort of respectful, introspective the men have been. We've been out speaking to major corporations all over the country. And what's incredible is, and probably not obvious to everyone, is how much the men, you can see them learning in the moment. It's kind of that moment where we make them aware of the little things that are the big things. And then they have that moment where they're understanding it. And then they're literally pulling from us kind of the advice about what do I say or do when I'm a bystander in the room? How do I, as a male leader, become an ally? And then if I am the leader or the boss or the manager, again, making myself aware of something that I might have been doing with all good intentions that might have been another brick in the wall. So that has been not obvious, and quite honestly, a joy for us is watching men engage in such a fulsome way.
So I'm Angelique Bellmer Krembs, and I'll be the caboose here. One of the non-obvious epiphanies that I think that we've had since the book came out and we've been speaking at many corporations is our experience has been in corporate America. And we have spanned 29 plus different industries within corporate America. So we thought, hey, this is really broad application. But what's been really interesting is that it applies way beyond corporate. Mm-hmm. So we can't find a scenario where it doesn't apply. We see it pop up in politics, the discussion of the congressional dads coming into focus, which reminds us of our Father of the Year chapter, or music. Taylor Swift put out a commentary about how the double standard exists in the music industry, where men can say something and it's considered strategic. A woman says the same thing and it's calculated. It's a different vocabulary, double standard. Even fascinating, we had a chance to speak to a government agency, New York City Office of Emergency Management, and seeing the similarities in our experience and with their experience was really eye-opening for us. And the last one I'll mention is the Air Force. We talked to women in science and engineering in the Air Force Research Laboratory, and they actually did a study on what is in the way for promotion of women and for women's attrition. And they found very similar things. It's about the little things in culture, in access to informal networks, access to sponsorship, a lot of the stuff that we talk in our book. And that was definitely non-obvious to us starting out that it would be so broadly applicable.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, the combination of the little things that you talk about and the things that sometimes I felt like you were describing as a little thing, but felt like for some people it could have been a big thing. And there were moments in the book where the perspectives of all of you came through, because you sort of said, well, one of us said this and one of us said that. And I wonder if, Katie, maybe you can talk to the idea and challenge of bringing 6 different perspectives on these topics together when sometimes you maybe didn't agree on what the reaction should be.
Yeah, it was a really interesting part of the process. We did this very collaboratively. We happened to do it while everybody was kind of trapped at home and on Zoom anyway. So we were using shared documents and collecting our different points of view. And what we realized very quickly is that the different points of view were a real strength here, that so many books that are written by one author have that one perspective and maybe one recommendation, but these can be really nuanced situations, and giving different ways to approach, think about, or handle a situation has been, I think, a value add into the conversation, because, sometimes a more direct approach is warranted. Sometimes a humorous approach is warranted. Sometimes a thought for how to pivot the situation is warranted. And it doesn't mean that you need to pick one point of view and only follow that. It's going to be situation by situation. So that really helped us, I think, bring our different points of view and our different answers into it. And then in other cases, we just flat out, there's, I think, a couple places where we think about it differently. And it's because it is a more complicated topic, and it is a more, just kind of, again, it's just a more nuanced situation. I think that's okay. And I think for all these things, just having conversation and getting people onto the same page and sharing some language allows those differences to exist maybe more productively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was interesting that some of it seemed to be cultural. I mean, I remember reading your chapter about awkward chivalry
Yeah.
and the idea
Yeah.
that, if a man stands up whenever a woman walks into a room, that's a Southern thing. And if you grew up in the
Yeah.
South, then it's
Right.
totally common. And if you didn't, then it seems weird. Why would you
Yeah.
do that? Why would you single that out? Lori, you talked a little bit about the reception that the book's been getting as you've been going and speaking about it across the
Mm-hmm.
country, maybe around the world. I'm not even sure. Talk a little bit about what people have shared back to you after you get off
Yeah.
stage and they come to you with their feedback or with their questions. What sort of things do you hear from them?
Yeah. So I think just it's sort of interesting, and what's a joy is when we actually get to speak in person. So we see this in real time, not just kind of over like a little square and a camera. So what I would say is for the women, for the most part, and I would say women and probably, someone who's not in the, in the sort of represented majority, right? So women and, possibly people that aren't, cisgender white men. They have this moment and you can literally see it on their face where they just feel seen. Like they just have this, it's like the body language is like a little bit like their thought bubble is saying like, thank you for validating that. I thought it was just me. We get a lot of that. I thought it was just me. I thought I was the only one who counted the room. I thought I was the only one who got asked to take the notes. I thought I was the only one who got volunteered for the culture task forces while the white men are seemingly on the M&A task forces. There's so much of a thank you, and I thought it was just me. So there's that. And then the other thing that we hear from them is, thank you for being so practical. So while we cite a lot of academic research, and we love academic research, it was very helpful to us, but we're operating executives by background. So we're very pragmatic. So the other thing we hear from people is, thank you for not just like citing the problem or opining on the problem, but actually for giving practical advice of what I can say and do in a given moment. And thank you for giving me 6 pieces of advice. Because as Katie mentioned, it does differ based on your level of psychological safety in the moment and, where you are. You were newly hired. You've been there a long time. It's your first day on the board. You've been on the board for a long time. A lot of different reasons why you would want a different piece of advice. So I think that's what largely we get from, I would say, from the women. The other thing that we get, I talked about the men, but I would say the other piece that is really an aha is this notion of the role that a bystander could play. And early on, we did a podcast with someone, and he said his 6-year-old daughter in school, they were talking about going from being bystanders to upstanders. And I love that language.
Yeah.
I don't even know if that's
That's great.
a word, but it's kind of that notion of if you are in the room, sometimes people think, well, I'm not the leader, I'm not the boss, so I can't be helpful. So I think the other thing that we're hearing, because we're sharing it and then it's registering, is, oh, if I'm in the room, I have a part to play. I don't have to be the most senior person in the room. But if I'm in the room when they say, oh, we're not going to offer that promotion to Sally because her husband has a big hedge fund job in New York and there's no way that she would relocate to Chicago. Well, even if you're just a bystander of any gender, you can say in that moment in a really respectful way, hey, gang, I know we're all trying to be helpful for that woman, but let's actually think about, we should probably offer her the role. We don't know what her marital situation is. We don't know if they're from Chicago. They've always dreamed of living in Chicago. Maybe her in-laws or her parents or her sister lives in Chicago. We have no idea. So why are we censoring? So I think the piece that has been a really just a wonderful piece of feedback is from the allies of all genders, realizing that they have a role. And mathematically, if you think about being in a room, most of the people mathematically are going to be the people that are bystanders, that either you make a choice, say nothing and you're complicit, or you become an upstander or an ally.
And one of the things that you mentioned, which really stood out to me because I identified with it a lot, was this idea of counting the room. And Mitzi, you had a comment in there about that principle, this whole idea of just kind of looking around and saying, the people around here, I'm the only, I'm the only one. I'm the outlier either because of my gender or because of, my racial background or because of my industry background, that I'm an outsider from a different industry. Was that a big element of what drove the book to be important to get out into the world? This idea of trying to embrace the onlyness and say to people out there, hey, you're not the only one. Like, I get you. Like, I see you. We have the same experience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that was the driving factor, but certainly as a woman of color, that was my experience in a lot of my early career until more women of color became prevalent in the environments and circles that I was in from a business perspective. And so the point was, I could go in certain meetings, in certain conferences, and I wouldn't have to count, 1, 2, 3, 4 women here. I could look and see I was the only female or female of color. And so when in that situation, what do you do? Right. And so my thinking was, okay, I'm the only one. How can I help get other women of color into our organization? How can I help those that are there thrive? And how can I help educate and support my non-African American colleagues to be more inclusive and more inviting of women of color in the work environment? So I'd say that was, the impetus is not to be the only forever.
Yeah. Amen to that. And I think that is changing, thankfully, because of just the way that our culture is shifting, but also because of books like yours. I mean, I think they're really important to share that experience. And Cie, I want to turn to you now and just talk about the process of dealing with some of the most common things that I know my female colleagues often hear at work. I don't know how you do it all. I don't know how you manage it all. Phrases like that, right? And you have a whole chapter on dealing with that. Was it easy to figure out what topics you wanted to cover because you've heard them so often? Like, did the table of contents for this book write itself?
Kinda. I mean, actually, we limited it to 31. There's certainly a lot more than 31, but we would when we were again. This is as the COVID was kicking off, and we thought we had like, hey, let's roll up our sleeve for 2 weeks while everyone's off. We didn't know it was going to be 2 years, and we just started talking about the things that we can't believe this is still happening. And do we have stories around it? So we'd all then write stories from kind of different perspectives on each chapter, and then we just kept on going and going. What about this? What about this? What about this? And we'd see if there was an area. So it was very. I have to say that it was. We actually had to whittle it down. It wasn't a stretch getting there at all. Unfortunately, there's so many of these small.
Maybe there's a part 2 coming.
Oh my gosh, yeah, no.
Yeah.
And again, we validated our anything we talk about is also validated by younger women today. It's not just something that's still that just happened to our generation. So unfortunately, a lot more than 31, but we highlighted 31.
Yeah, and Angelique, one of the things that stood out to me was just how many people's perspective you brought in through interviews. And it was clear that you had used your network of all the people that you'd connected with and maybe managed over the past to kind of bring in some of the kind of newer, younger perspectives. It was interesting to me that a lot of those stories, the way you told them could easily have gone into a really negative space. I mean, when you ask people about these experiences, a lot of times it can kind of turn into like a bitch session, right? Where you're just like talking about these things that are really, really making you angry, or like the worst thing that happened to you. Was it hard for you to maintain this positive move forward tone as you brought these stories out?
I'm so glad you asked that question because we actually spent a lot of time talking about the tonality of the book and everything that we do subsequently, because we know that on difficult systemic issues like this, progress is made either through heat or light. And we wanted to be light. And we knew because it was so important to be calling men in to the conversation, we knew that audience was so critical for progress that we said we have to stay positive, we have to stay productive. And it actually kind of fit with our brand and our personalities to infuse as much humor as possible, and keep it conversational, keep it easy to access. And we're very bantery amongst the group of us, but we wanted that chemistry to also translate into inviting people into the conversation. So that's definitely been our theme, and we work at that to make sure that always stays true. And like we might collaborate with someone and they'll, try to take us in a direction, and we'll be like, that's not our brand. Like we are light, our tone is positive and inviting people in.
Yeah, and I thought that you did. I mean, I'm a brand guy. All of you have marketing backgrounds. Title is the brand of the book, and I know that from reading it, one of the alternate titles you considered was just "Still" with like a question mark and like multiple exclamation points, which would have gone in a different. It would have taken the book in a different direction, a little angrier of a direction, and instead, "You Should Smile More" was kind of like this tongue-in-cheek title. So this is kind of an open-ended question, but like, did the title just come to you? Like, how did that title come to be?
I'll add, we talked about the title a lot, but I want to talk and highlight really our focus was on solutions. I think we believe and hope that we will be able to dismantle gender bias, and it's going to take all of us. And so our thought process was, how can we create solutions? So not just say, here's what the challenge is, but how can we actually create solutions, create momentum to make progress? And I think that was key for us in maintaining this positive optimism and attitude.
And when
Katie, do you want to take credit for coming up with the title? I feel like there's a little bit of like when we worked at Pepsi and they would say like back in the day, like who invented the Pepsi challenge? And like, everybody's like hand would go up and like, I was the father of the Pepsi challenge. I was the mother of the Pepsi challenge. And so I don't know that we've ever aligned on this of like where actually like when that moment was that like, this is the title.
But I remember it distinctly. I remember where I was, Angelique and I having sidebar conversations.
Oh yes, I remember that.
So, so the title is one of the chapters in the book, right? You Should Smile More, and it was something that was said to me in a performance review, and it was just one of those examples. It turned out to be just such a classic telling example, right? Because it was said to me by a very well-meaning, very supportive boss. And I was senior, and it just kind of blindsided me because I was like, wow, it felt weird. And I was at a senior enough level to not be as bowled over by it as I probably would have been 10 years earlier, but I was still knocked by it enough to be recounting it, 15 years later or whatever, and still kind of, just bothered by it a little bit because I knew a guy would never be told that, even though I also knew it was coming from a well-meaning place. And that is such a consistent theme with so many of these examples. And the other thing that became, I think, such a telling moment or a telling point of the title is that the title absolutely exposes exactly what we're talking about. There are many men who don't even understand that the title of the book is tongue in cheek, and women see it and immediately get it. And I mean, you can be 15 years old, you can be 75 years old. You've been told something like that. You've either been told to smile more or you've been told to smile less. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find a woman who hasn't been told some version of that throughout her career, or just frankly walking down the street.
Yeah, I have to imagine that writing this book in some ways was therapeutic, because you could get these things out that you'd been maybe, I don't want to say holding on to for a long time, but at least remembering for a long time, right?
It was, and possibly embellishing, but we're not sure.
It is a book. You gotta add a little bit of the theater to it to make it readable. And it was highly readable. I mean, for anyone who is watching this but hasn't read the book yet, you should definitely pick up a copy, because it is a very easy read. I think I don't know what time. I mean, I read pretty fast already, but this was a particularly fast read in a good way, because I was able to really get some great insights out of it. And I really felt like it was fast paced and moving. And some of the things that you had learned, or that all of you, your band of sisters, shared as learnings, were things that I really personally identified with. So I wrote a career advice book called Always Eat Left-Handed, which had its own tongue-in-cheek title. But one of the chapters was titled Start Smoking. And it was based on me moving to Australia and realizing that everyone was bonding over these smoking breaks and I didn't smoke, and I felt left out. and some of the analogies that you also used when it came to sports talk. I mean, I moved to a place where they were talking about rugby, and I knew nothing about rugby, or cricket, and I knew nothing about cricket. And so all of these experiences that sometimes I think men who are reading the book, they may find it difficult to identify with, took me right back to that moment where I was very much an outsider. And I'm just wondering, like, one of the things that you do talk about, and this is kind of a tricky thing, is how much do you conform to that and say, oh yeah, I'll go on the golfing thing, even though you never played golf. And I don't like golf. I never play golf. But I've felt that pressure of, oh, it's all happening on the golf course. I better go out there and like at least show up, even though I'm going to probably be pretty bad at it. How much of that pressure in there do you land on advising people to just go and do it, just show up, even though you have, I think what you called it was like an invitation, like they invite you to come, but they don't really want you to come. So how much of it was that? Lori, maybe I'll go to you for this one.
Yeah. So this is such a great representation of the power of 6 women writing a book. And it's funny because sometimes people say like 6 women as though we're like a monolith. And I always say, no, like we're different ages, like we're Jewish, we're Christian, we're gay, we're straight, we're Black, we're white, we're suburban, we're urban, we're mothers, we're stepmoms, we're, aunts. So like, we're not the same person just because we happen to be women and we happen to have worked at Pepsi, over, a decade together. So the chapter that you, that this reminds me of what you're talking about is the at the table, not in the conversation, right? And so that's the typical, this is very appropriate after the Super Bowl, but sort of the typical Monday morning conversation. I always talked about, the first 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes of my boss's senior staff meeting was talking about the Eagles game. Sorry, Eagles, from the day before. And so you're physically at the table, but you're not in the conversation. And that was a good example when we debated it. We decided there is no right answer. And I would say in general, you sort of have to pick your moments and decide. Everything can't be a battle. There are times when you decide, no, I'm going to go where things are. So that's a good example of, there's everything from sort of the gentle pivot, what I would always do, which is like, no, I didn't see the game, but there was that, what did you think of the M&M's commercial that was on the game? So still talked about the game, but kind of gently pivoted it to something that was more around our business, advertising, marketing, without calling anybody out. I just did it really seamlessly. Some people had sort of a, kind of a language, the language of corporate America it's sports. And so stop fighting it. And that's an easy one to kind of jump in, maybe like, just, read the sports section that morning or whatever, or even kind of jump in and go forward and go, no, I didn't see the game, but who's playing next week? What do you think is going to happen next week? So there's everything from sort of, pivot it without people realizing it. There's kind of study up and learn a little bit. There's be sort of adjacent to it where you're kind of talking about it, but you're really just sort of moving forward. And so I think the answer to your question is there isn't a right answer. You sort of have to pick based on the conversation, how much you sort of jump in and become a part of things versus there are times in certain situations where you might say, hey, this isn't really that inclusive to everyone. Let's talk about something else. And you can't always be the one that is calling people out. And yet I would never advise people to do what we did, which I would say 95% of my playbook when I was in corporate America was go along to get along. Because if you do all of that, nothing ever changes. So I think it's sort of finding the right place along that continuum for any given situation.
Yeah, it was interesting to me the places where you chose to start with language, and especially there was a part, I think there was a chapter about uptalk, and the perspective around uptalk was sort of surprising to me. It wasn't what I expected to read. Angelique, maybe you could talk a little bit about that language and why uptalk may not necessarily be the thing that we should all try and avoid as it often is painted to be.
Well, this whole category of gendered language, I think, has a lot more runway ahead of it in our thesis exploration. Well, and I'll say, starting with just even the basic, calling a woman a girl in the office, because we didn't all agree that it was important. And me personally, like, I started out saying, like, really, that's not that critical. But then I saw the research, and then it happened to me. And like with being informed by all the research made me realize, like, actually it does matter. And then I saw it, with my kids who are teenagers. And so you come to a new perspective once you spend any few minutes thinking about it, consciously, right? Because this is all unconscious stuff that if you don't think about it, you carry on. And I think uptalk is a similar thing where, it's a style element that shouldn't be penalizing to women if they have a certain style of talking, just like smiling or not smiling, or any of those other number of narrow places where women have to stand on a balance beam. So the data would say that how your voice is heard in the meeting can affect how people hear you. But if more people can be listening, with open minds and listening harder to people who don't look and sound like them, then more things will be heard. More surprising, more non-obvious things will actually break through. So that's why it matters.
Yeah, and the personality element of it also matters. And see, one of the things that you had shared in the book, in your perspective, specifically around the struggle for likability. And this is a hot topic for me because my second book was called Leconomics, and it was all about why we choose to do business with people we like very often, regardless of gender. And you had some interesting science behind it, but you also had some interesting perspectives to bring together because, I mean, it's a very human thing to want to be liked, but it can also take you in the direction of doing things that aren't in your character or trying to be someone who you're not. How important was that concept to really pick apart and maybe explore and unpack in the book?
I think women in general probably lean towards this. I think me specifically definitely did. I was like a closeted lesbian my entire career, and I was always worried about being liked. Because back in the late 70s, obviously was where society was. It was considered a mental disease, blah 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 blah. And so it was just I was always worried about my friends in high school or what my college, or will I get a job? Will I keep a job? Will I get promoted? So I feel like I put wanting to be liked was a very high priority for me. And, I think I was pretty successful, but, that's interesting debate. So I feel like in that regard, I think because I had this invisible difference that I feel like maybe never feel completely included early in my career, maybe the majority of my career, for me, I put a really high premium on that. And so there's probably somewhat unique to my background in that situation. But I think in general, I think women want to be liked, so they'll all caveat stuff or don't want to irritate people or put a lot of "I'm sorry, hey," language like "hey, just checking up," and they're just always trying to kind of, not irritate people. And I think women do a lot more of that than men do. I don't think it's.
And how do you feel? How do you feel like your relationship to the whole likability thing is now versus the way it was?
I mean, I think it's definitely, I've definitely gotten more confidence as I've gotten older, and obviously society's changed. At this point, I don't care if you don't like me because I'm gay. That's a great screener. So I don't care. And I almost, think, bring it on. So in that regard, I think that's kind of, but, it played a huge role for for 30 years. So it's not to be minimized, but now, I'm not as concerned at all. And, I know I am likable. So.
Well, I'm finding you perfectly likable, all of you. So
I'm finding Cie marginally likable.
Well, the fact that you're still talking to each other after doing a book together is a good start.
That's true.
Sometimes that whole process just takes people apart, in not a good way. So, Katie, one of the things that projecting forward for the book, I would love for you to talk about is, when people do read the book and when they internalize some of the ideas, whether they are female or male, or they define their gender otherwise, what is the big thing that you hope people take away from the book? And what is the big behavior that you maybe hope people can change?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you use the word big, right? Because I think what we're looking for is, let's start little. Do something in your next interaction. And that's really what we are out speaking to a lot of groups, and it's what we challenge right at the end is, in your next meeting, you can do something. And we give really specific examples. And we also give very specific real life examples because the book has been out for several months. We've had, a number, and this is where, we get really excited because we've had a number of male colleagues read it and internalize it and then act on it and then report back and just be kind of kind of shocked at how easy it was. It just, the small things. Angelique has a great story of a colleague who, a very senior man, he had two senior people reporting to him, a man and a woman. The meeting was starting. He was doing an online meeting. He stopped the woman from automatically taking notes, asked the guy to take notes instead. And her feedback to him was immediate and positive about how she felt more validated and seen in their entire tenure than she ever had. I mean, talk about awesome feedback. Like, you can do that right then. We've got several other stories. So that's really what we want people to do, is there's something that they can do right now. And listen, we're not going to change it in one fell swoop. We're not going to change the whole, everything that's out there in 2 weeks, but every single person, male, female, bystander, leader, participant, can do something each moment, because that's if these are microaggressions, then it's micro actions that can counter them, and they can do it one at a time, and you can do it every day.
Such an important reminder, because we do tend to focus on let's make these kind of total turnaround changes in all of these things in our lives. And beginning of the year, everyone's like, okay, I'm gonna become vegan and start exercising every day. And then what happens a couple of weeks later, right? It's like, I can't do this anymore.
Nacho chips and chili, right?
Yeah. It was exactly. You were like, then the Super Bowl rolls around, and you're like, all right, time for the wings. I can't do this anymore. And I think that is an important reminder that you do have the opportunity to start with some of these smaller.
Yeah.
We're coming to a close of our time together, but I want to introduce one more round robin question, if I can, for everyone, which is, what is the biggest change that's happened for you as a result of having this book out in the world? And maybe we'll go with maybe we'll start with you, Angelique. We haven't heard from you in a little while.
Biggest change. I think going into it with the publishing of the book, I expected that our network would be very supportive, and I was anticipating, hoping for great response from our PepsiCo friends, our alumni friends, and then our broader network, and they delivered, amazingly. What surprised me, and I think what changed me, is how much further it's been reaching, and it's been really interesting to meet new people that are in none of our networks and realize that this has further application, has further to go. And I think it's made us start to think about what more should we do with this? Like, how do we keep the conversation going, and bringing ideas, that we could consider on how to make more of it. And I'm not sure that I expected that, but it's not just write the book and now we're done. It's like, and this has now started a conversation, which is what we hoped it would. And now we have to follow that conversation. So I think that's been exciting for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. Lori, why don't you go next?
So I think for me, when we went out, we did the interviews. We primarily interviewed women, sort of like 25 to 45, who are, kind of the core target of the book. But we also went out, we interviewed a lot of male, current and former colleagues, current and former male bosses. And again, I'll just as a visual aid, like when you see the title of the book, like you should smile more. And a lot of times what would happen is they would say, again, really like wonderful friends, well-meaning men, they would say like, oh, does that happen? Is that a thing? Like, I didn't know women got told to smile more. So again, it's that whole, like, make them aware, don't make them feel bad. And then, like I talked about before, help them down the journey of, okay, now you know, and here's what you can say or do. So I think the thing that has changed me is realizing that there's so many situations where I am probably the person going, oh, I didn't know that. And whether that's with, women of color, and, was I a person that you say like, oh, can I touch your braids? I don't know. Like, so what it's like to be, LGBT. Like there's a lot of things that I don't know, and a lot of the like, oh, I didn't know that happened. And so what I feel like what's really changed me is being aware of that, and how little I know about so many other areas, and to try and be a person that is really a lifelong learner, that doesn't assume I know everything, and be really open to learning and growing and having those moments for myself.
It's great learning. Mitzi, how about you?
I think for me, the situation that really resonated with me was my colleague's husband wanting to read the book first and hearing him talk about it. It just reemphasized for me the whole power of allies and having more and more conversations with men, and just the suggestions and the ideas that they have and their excitement about, okay, I'm going to handle this differently in the workplace. There's a lot of power in there. That's been very surprising to me, and something I definitely have been talking a lot more about with men, allyship.
See, let's go to you next, and then Katie, you can close us out.
So for me, the thing that I think is surprised me is how much people want to have a conversation about it. People know I was involved in writing the book, so people have written it up in all different types of formats, and it dominates every conversation that I go into, because people want to be like, oh, the women have a story, and then they want to go on, and so like we'll be at a baby shower. I'm like, okay, thank you, but can we go back? And you can't get people off it. You dominate dinner conversations. So I literally find myself trying to like suppress it, because of the fact that I don't want to be like, oh my God, we're going to talk about it again, but you can't get people to stop talking about it. So that has been surprising, of how much appetite there are for people, women in particular, to talk about this, and everyone wants to share their story. And sometimes it changes. Almost most conversation can veer that way, and I almost have to try to get them off it.
So for me, I think, what's changed really is I've become, I'd say, more impatient about the pace of change, and that, with each moment that happens, right, you've got a chance, you could have a choice to ignore it, or to deal with it in the moment, or deal with it later. And in many cases, I've probably chosen the first. I'm way less willing to do that now, and and I coach young women the same thing, and I'll circle it back to one of your earlier questions about things like the up talk and stuff like that, where, 10 years ago, I probably would have been very definitive with younger women about, no, this is what you do to kind of survive or thrive in a corporate environment. I'm now more like, no, the young women need to help lead the way here, because that's how things change, right? Is that we don't all have to fit into this box that's been created. We need to broaden this. We need to broaden the box. And I'm so, and I'm heartened and optimistic about this generation of young women coming up, and their willingness to, I think, push and challenge and make everything better, and kind of, I think, help force a more inclusive environment. And I think the rest of us, our job is to help get it there for them.
I love it. Ending on a positive, uplifting message. That's so good. We've been talking to the Band of Sisters, a group of authors of a book called You Should Smile More, which is a fantastic look at how to dismantle gender bias in the workplace. I want to thank all 5 of you for joining me today. It's been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.